Night. Windsor Great Park. Behind the trees, one royal house glows like a ghost that refuses to leave. This is the tragic story of Prince Andrew's most scandalous mansion. Royal Lodge, a $30 million home on almost 100 acres of land that now feels less like a palace and more like a trap. Imagine a house that costs up to $5 million a year just to stay alive, to stop the roof from leaking, the paint from cracking, the gardens from turning into a jungle. Now imagine the prince who lives there. With no official royal job, no public salary, and a reputation hit by one of the worst scandals in modern royal history. Outside the gates, the country is angry. Inside, the bills keep growing. The pressure from the palace is rising. And the man in the middle refuses to move out of the home he calls his last safe place. But why did Andrew fight so hard to lock himself inside this house? What secret deals, family promises, and hidden fears are buried under Royal Lodge's perfect lawns? And how long can one mansion hold up an entire royal scandal before it finally collapses? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. The Day the Gates Closed. The call to action fades. The camera lingers on Royal Lodge for one more heartbeat, then pulls back slowly through the morning mist. It is autumn of 2022. The gates are shut, security vans idle at the perimeter. Beyond the iron bars, the house looks calm. White walls, dark windows, old trees standing guard as they always have. But something is different. The news vans arrived first, then the photographers. Then the headlines, each sharper than the last. Prince steps back. Duke loses titles. Royal Lodge future unclear. Inside, life continues in careful silence. Staff move through the corridors. Dogs sleep on antique sofas. The kitchen still prepares 3 meals a day. Yet everyone knows the protective bubble has burst. This is not a sudden collapse. Royal Lodge has been sinking for years. Quietly, politely, the way old houses do when no one wants to admit the foundations are failing. The removal vans outside are not yet here to strip the rooms. They are a precaution, an insurance policy, a warning that what once felt permanent might not survive much longer. For decades, this house stood for comfort. It was a place where royals could drop the mask and be almost ordinary. Walk the dogs, read the newspapers, eat breakfast without cameras watching. King George VI loved it. The Queen Mother made it her home for half a century. Young Elizabeth played in the garden and tasted what a normal childhood might feel like, even though hers could never truly be normal. Then Andrew took the lease. He spent millions renovating, raised his daughters here, tried to build a life he believed no scandal could ever touch. He was wrong. Now the house that once symbolized royal warmth has become something very different. A fortress where a prince hides from consequences. A mansion that costs far too much for a man with almost no visible income. A lightning rod that stirs public anger every time his name appears in the news. The question everyone asks seems simple. Why does he not just leave? The answer sits tangled in lease agreements, family loyalty, personal pride, and a lifetime of believing that royal status means never having to say you were wrong. But to understand how Royal Lodge turned into the most toxic address on the royal estate, you have to go back. Not just to the scandal, not even to Andrew's first day in the house. You have to go back to when this place was built and see what it was always meant to be. A hiding place. A retreat for people who needed to escape the weight of the crown without surrendering it completely. A soft landing for royals who could not quite manage palace life, but still deserved comfort and privacy. For 2 centuries, that arrangement worked. Kings and queens came here to rest. Lovers met in secret. Widows mourned in peace. The house absorbed their stories without judgment. But Royal Lodge was never designed to shelter someone the country once held to account. It was never meant to be the backdrop for a clash where privilege and scandal collide so loudly that the walls themselves seem stained. And it was certainly not built to withstand the kind of modern scrutiny that turns every detail, every unpaid bill, every closed curtain, every refusal to move out, into a symbol of everything people think is broken about inherited power. The gates are still closed, the house is still standing, but from the outside, the siege has begun. Royal Lodge was not always like this. For 200 years, it served a simpler purpose, a place where royals could drop the performance and breathe. No cameras, no rigid protocol, just family. The scandal came later. Chapter 2: The King's Cottage. Royal Lodge began as something no one would have called a mansion. In the year 1662, it was a simple keeper's lodge, a working building in Windsor Great Park where staff lived while managing the royal hunting grounds. Small rooms, low ceilings. Built for function, not for show. For more than a century, it stayed that way. Royals rode past it on hunts but never thought to live there. It was too plain, too far from the palace, too ordinary to belong to the world of crowns and ceremonies. Then, in the year 1812, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, noticed it. He was already turning Brighton into his fantasy palace and remaking Windsor Castle into a Gothic fortress. Yet he saw potential in the little lodge, tucked among the trees. He ordered it expanded. New wings. More rooms, classical proportions. A cottage large enough for a king, but still small enough to feel private. The work took years. By the time it was finished, Royal Lodge had turned into something between a country house and a royal retreat. Comfortable, but not grand. Elegant, but never intimidating. George IV used it from time to time. His brother, William IV, preferred other estates. The house drifted in and out of use, hosting minor royals and guests who needed somewhere quiet to stay, away from stiff palace corridors. Then came Queen Victoria. She did not live at Royal Lodge, but she understood exactly what it was for. Windsor Castle was for state business and formal life. Royal Lodge was for escape. She let family members use it when they needed distance from court pressures and the watchful eyes inside the castle. The pattern was set. Royal Lodge became the place you went when the palace felt too heavy, when you needed to ride horses without an audience, when you wanted your children to play in a garden that felt almost normal. It was never really about grandeur. It was about relief. By the early 1900s, the house had settled into a rhythm. It hosted younger royals, lesser titles, and occasional guests. The rooms were comfortable, but not luxurious. The grounds were beautiful, but not overly formal. It felt more like a large family home than an official royal address. Staff who worked there later remembered it as one of the easier postings. Less ceremony, fewer rules. Royals who stayed at Royal Lodge tended to relax. They ate simpler meals, dressed more casually, laughed louder. The house absorbed that mood. Within the family, it became known as a safe place. Somewhere you could admit you were tired, frustrated, or unsure without it instantly turning into a scandal. That reputation would prove crucial in the year 1931. King George V was still on the throne, but his second son, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, was struggling, shy, nervous, crushed by a stammer that turned public speaking into torture. His older brother, the future Edward VIII, was charismatic and confident. Albert felt like the backup, the lesser son standing in the shadows. He needed a home where he did not have to perform every minute. George V offered him royal lodge. Albert accepted. He moved in with his wife, Elizabeth, and their two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The family that would define the next era of royal lodge had arrived. For Albert, the house became a refuge. He could practice his speeches in private, walk the grounds without courtiers watching his every move, be a father without photographers turning each moment into a headline. His daughters ran wild in the garden. They climbed trees, built forts, played with the dogs. Elizabeth, the future queen, later called Royal Lodge the only place where her childhood felt real. The house wrapped itself around them, warm, quiet, protective. No one yet knew that within a few years, Albert would become King George VI, and Royal Lodge would become the place where a broken man learned how to carry a crown he had never wanted. Chapter 3. The Queen Mother's Garden. Albert became king in the year 1936, not by choice, not by plan. His brother, Edward VIII, abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, and suddenly the shy, stammering Duke was George VI, king of an empire that still stretched over roughly a quarter of the globe. He was terrified. The palace tried to prepare him. Advisors coached him. Speechwriters crafted careful scripts line by line. But the weight did not lift. George VI felt like an understudy pushed onto the stage on opening night with no rehearsal and every eye on him. Royal Lodge became his anchor. Even as king, he refused to give it up. Buckingham Palace was for work. Windsor Castle was for state occasions. But Royal Lodge was home, the only place where he could stop pretending he had everything under control and admit, if only to himself, that he did not. His wife, now Queen Elizabeth, understood this instinct completely. She turned the house into a fortress of normality. Sunday lunches, garden picnics, evening walks with the dogs. The girls still climbed the same trees, wore the same muddy boots, dragged the same dirt through the halls. In the year 1932, before he ever took the crown, the people of Wales had given Princess Elizabeth a gift that would define Royal Lodge for generations. A miniature house called Boothyn Bach, the little cottage. It sat in the garden, a perfect replica of a Welsh cottage, scaled down to child size. 2 small rooms, working doors and windows, tiny furniture. A little kitchen with running water. Elizabeth and Margaret treated it like their private kingdom. They swept the floors, arranged the dishes, invited guests for pretend tea. It was the only space in their lives where they had complete control, where being a princess did not matter and no one was watching. The little house is still there. When war came in the year 1939, Royal Lodge became something else, a hiding place, in the most literal sense. George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to evacuate themselves. They stayed in London during the Blitz, but they sent Elizabeth and Margaret to Windsor Castle for safety. Royal Lodge sat empty for months at a time, shuttered and dark, like a stage waiting for its actors to return. After air raids, the family would retreat there to recover. The house had no military importance, no strategic value, just quiet rooms where a king could stop performing courage for a few hours and finally admit he was exhausted. Staff remembered those years as strange. Long silences, a tension in the air that never quite lifted. The king pacing the halls late at night, smoking too much, worrying about his country, his daughters, and whether the next night would be worse than the last. But Royal Lodge held him. It gave him space to fall apart in private so that he could hold himself together in public. The war ended. Britain survived. George VI had proved stronger than almost anyone expected, but the effort had quietly destroyed his health. He died in the year 1952, suddenly. A heart attack in his sleep at Sandringham. Queen Elizabeth became the Queen Mother overnight. Her daughter was now Elizabeth II. The old life was gone. She could have moved anywhere. Clarence House, a grace and favor apartment, a smaller country estate with fewer memories. She chose Royal Lodge. She stayed for 50 years. The house that had once sheltered a nervous father now sheltered a grieving widow. She kept his rooms almost exactly as he had left them. His books on the shelves, his favorite chair by the window, photographs on every surface. The garden became her obsession. She widened the flower beds, added new paths, and slowly turned the grounds into one of the most beautiful private gardens in all of England. The little Welsh cottage remained in its corner. Her grandsons, Charles, Andrew, Edward, played there as children, just as Elizabeth and Margaret had before them. Royal Lodge became a living memory, a place where time moved more slowly, where the Queen Mother could hold on to the life she had lost when her husband became king and then died too young. By the time she reached her 90s, the house and the woman had become inseparable. Staff spoke about her in the present tense, even when they were remembering the past. She was always there. She always would be. Until the year 2002. Chapter 4. A Prince, a Divorce, and a Second Chance. The Queen Mother died in March of the year 2002. She was 101 years old. Royal Lodge had been hers for half a century. Now, for the first time since the 1930s, the house stood empty. The family had to decide what came next. Some suggested turning it into a museum. Others argued it should be split into apartments for minor royals. A few voices said it ought to be handed back to the Crown Estate and leased to someone outside the family altogether. Queen Elizabeth II had a different idea. She offered it to her second son, Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Andrew was 52. He had been divorced from Sarah Ferguson for 6 years, living partly in a grace and favor apartment at Buckingham Palace and partly in a country house he still, awkwardly, shared with his ex-wife. He had 2 daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie. Growing up split between parents, between locations, between the official version of royal life they were supposed to have and the messy reality they actually lived. Andrew wanted stability, a place that felt permanent, somewhere his daughters could call home without footnotes or explanations. Royal Lodge looked perfect for that role. The Queen offered him a 75-year lease through the Crown Estate. The terms were complicated but generous. Andrew would pay £250 a week in rent, far below market rate. In return, he would personally finance a massive renovation, new roofs, updated wiring and heating, repaired stonework, restored exterior details. The bill reportedly came to £7.5 million. Andrew paid it. He treated the deal as an investment, not in bricks and land, but in legacy. This was not just another house. It was the place where his grandmother had lived, where his mother had played as a child, where royal history clung to every corridor. He moved in during the year 2004. Sarah moved in with him. On paper, they were divorced. Officially, they led separate lives, but they had never truly separated. They shared custody, shared holidays, shared the unspoken understanding that their marriage had failed, but their partnership and loyalty to each other had somehow survived. Royal Lodge became the physical proof of that strange arrangement. 2 people who could not stay married but could not quite let go, living together inside a mansion that felt like its own sealed world. The girls loved it. Beatrice and Eugenie had grown up under the harsh glare of tabloid headlines about their parents' divorce, their bodies, their clothes, even their usefulness to the royal family. At Royal Lodge, they could disappear. They rode horses in the park, walked the dogs down quiet lanes, played in the same garden cottage their grandmother had played in some 70 years earlier. For Andrew, the house felt like redemption. His Navy career had ended. His marriage had collapsed. The tabloids had spent years sneering at him as a buffoon, a playboy, a prince who embarrassed the monarchy more than he helped it. Royal Lodge was supposed to rewrite that story. A stable home, a devoted father, a man who finally understood what mattered. He hosted family gatherings. The Queen visited regularly. Charles and his sons came for lunches. The house filled again with the kind of life it had known under the Queen Mother. Informal, warm, multi-generational. Andrew felt safe. The lease was secure. The renovations were finished. His daughters were happy. He had a role, not a full-time working royal, but something he valued more, a family anchor. The keeper of a house that carried real weight in royal memory. He believed the worst was behind him. The bills were manageable then. He still received money from the Queen's private income. He had a Navy pension. Sarah contributed with earnings from book deals and public appearances. Royal Lodge cost roughly £250,000 a year to maintain, expensive but not impossible. Andrew settled in. He bought new furniture, repainted rooms to suit his own taste. Slowly, almost without noticing, he erased his grandmother's aesthetic and replaced it with his own. The house stopped being the Queen Mother's and became his. No one warned him how fast that feeling of security could vanish. How a few photographs, a handful of friendships, and a series of disastrous choices could turn his safe haven into a cage. The trap was already being built. Andrew just did not see it yet. Chapter 5. A house built on special rules. The lease Andrew signed was not a normal lease. Most people who rent a house pay something close to market rates and look after the basics. The landlord handles the big repairs. The tenant can leave with proper notice and a few signatures. Royal Lodge operated on a completely different logic. Andrew's deal ran through the Crown Estate. The huge portfolio of land and buildings technically owned by the monarch but managed as a separate business. The Crown Estate oversees everything from London office towers to stretches of rural farmland to historic royal homes that no longer function as official palaces. Royal Lodge sat in that last category. Too large for modern royal life, too expensive to leave empty, too historically sensitive to hand over to just anyone with money. The answer they found was a 75-year lease at £250 per week, roughly £13,000 per year. For comparison, similar country houses in the area can rent for £500,000 a year or more. Andrew was paying less than 3% of the going rate, but the discount came with strings attached. Andrew had to fund every renovation himself, not just redecorating or new curtains, full structural restoration, roofs stripped and rebuilt, plumbing replaced, electrical systems brought up to code, crumbling stonework repaired, the kind of deep work that costs millions and never truly ends in a house first built in the 19th century. He also had to maintain the estate to Crown Estate standards. That meant professional gardeners, tree surgeons, and ground staff. Regular inspections. Immediate action whenever damp appeared, tiles slipped, or masonry cracked. And he could not sublet, could not sell on the lease, could not turn it into a money-making asset. One day the lease could pass to his daughters, but only if the Crown Estate agreed. On paper, it was a neat bargain. Low rent in exchange for high responsibility. In reality, it tied Andrew to a long, expensive commitment built on the assumption that he would always have serious money coming in. For many years, that assumption held. As a working royal, Andrew received an annual allowance from the Queen's private funds, the Duchy of Lancaster. Estimates put it at around £249,000 per year. Not enormous by royal standards, but enough to cover staff wages, routine maintenance, and daily life at Royal Lodge. On top of that, he had his Navy pension, income from investments, occasional consulting fees from companies happy to pay for a royal name on the invite list. On the spreadsheets, the house looked manageable. Inside, Andrew and Sarah built a life that puzzled almost everyone who tried to label it. Divorced, but living together. Separate wings, but shared meals. Independent romantic lives, but united parenting. Staff called it the arrangement. Visitors called it odd. The tabloids called it a circus, but in practice, it functioned. The girls had one stable base. Andrew had companionship. Sarah had a roof over her head after years of money trouble and public shaming following the divorce. Royal Lodge absorbed the strangeness without complaint. It had seen far worse. Mistresses smuggled in, secret marriages, royals who drank too heavily, spent too freely, or made choices that would have destroyed anyone without a title as a shield. One more unconventional household barely registered in its walls. Andrew entertained constantly. Business contacts, foreign dignitaries, old comrades from his Navy days, people who wanted access to a prince and were willing to ignore his reputation if it got them closer to power. The house gave him status, leading guests through rooms his grandmother had lived in, pointing out gardens where future queens had played. All of it reminded everyone, including Andrew himself, that he mattered. That he was plugged into a story much bigger than his own life. He needed that reassurance, more than he ever admitted. His older brother Charles was the heir. His younger brother Edward was quietly effective. His sister Anne was widely respected for her relentless work ethic. Andrew was the spare who had fought bravely in the Falklands War, and then spent more than 30 years trying to prove he was still important. Royal Lodge became his evidence, yet the same lease that made him feel protected also left him exposed. He had poured millions into a house he did not own. He had agreed to maintenance costs that would only grow as the building aged and failed in new ways. He had wrapped his public image and private identity around a property that could, in theory, be taken away if the ground beneath him shifted. The Crown Estate owned the walls and the land. The Queen controlled his allowance. His role as a working royal was what justified both of those supports. Andrew's sense of safety relied on all three pillars staying exactly the same. By the year 2010, hairline cracks were starting to show. Tabloid stories questioned his business friendships. Expenses scandals turned royal spending into a public minefield. Quiet muttering began about associates whose names would later sound radioactive. Andrew ignored the signs. From inside its gates, Royal Lodge felt too solid, too rooted in history to ever truly fall. He was wrong. Chapter 6. Life Inside the Bubble. By the year 2015, Royal Lodge had become Andrew's entire world. The house had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, as long as you ignored everything beyond the gates. Mornings began with dogs. Andrew kept several of them. A rotating pack of corgis and other breeds that drifted through rooms filled with antique furniture as if they owned the place. Staff learned to work around them. Sofas lost their sharp lines. Carpets collected hair. Nobody complained. This was simply how the house lived. Breakfast was informal. Sarah often joined him at the table. They read newspapers, discussed the girls, planned the day in low voices. To outsiders, it was disorienting. A divorced couple who behaved like a long-married pair in everything except legal status. The rooms reflected Andrew's taste more than inherited royal tradition. After moving in, he had stripped away much of his grandmother's gentle florals and soft pastels, replacing them with heavier furniture, darker shades, and spaces that felt more overtly masculine. Photographs covered almost every flat surface. Andrew with world leaders, Andrew in naval uniform, Andrew with his daughters at different stages of their lives. The walls repeated the story he wanted people to remember. A prince who had served, who was connected, who still belonged. Keeping that story alive required a small army. Royal Lodge needed a full team. housekeepers, groundskeepers, cooks, security officers, drivers. The payroll ran to hundreds of thousands of pounds each year. They managed a house that had to be permanently ready for a last-minute visit from the Queen, ready for family gatherings that might suddenly expand to dozens of people, ready for Andrew to sweep guests through on informal tours, pointing out the garden cottage and the rooms where earlier generations had lived and grieved. Yet fewer visitors came than Andrew would have liked. His official royal diary had thinned over time. There were fewer engagements, fewer ribbon cuttings, fewer invitations where his presence was considered essential. His role as special representative for international trade and investment had ended badly, criticized as costly, ineffective, and uncomfortably close to some controversial individuals. Royal Lodge became the compensation prize. If the institution no longer needed him as a visible working royal, he could still be the custodian of an important house, the keeper of family memory, the link back to his grandmother's world. Beatrice and Eugenie came and went. They had jobs, partners, London flats, lives of their own. But they returned often. Royal Lodge was still home base, still the one place where they felt like themselves, rather than minor royals being graded on outfits, expressions, and posture. The garden cottage remained their small kingdom. They no longer played house there, but the little building held too much history to abandon. Sometimes they brought friends inside, showing them the tiny kitchen, the child-sized furniture, the sense that time had been frozen for decades. For Andrew's daughters, Royal Lodge stood for something simple and good, a childhood that had been secure and affectionate, despite their parents' divorce and the constant noise of the tabloids. Andrew clung to that meaning. If his girls loved the house, he told himself, then he must have done at least one thing right. Security wrapped the property like invisible armor, armed police at the perimeter, cameras watching every approach road, alarms on each door and window. Windsor Great Park added another protective layer, thousands of acres of controlled land between Royal Lodge and the outside world. Inside that bubble, Andrew could behave as if the external narrative did not exist. He hosted dinner parties, long evenings with old Navy friends, business contacts, and people who still addressed him with the deference he craved. Conversation tended to loop around the same subjects: war stories, deals that might happen, complaints about journalists who never got the full picture. No one in those rooms pushed back. No one was required to. Royal Lodge filtered out dissent, along with the noise of the main roads. The house made a selective reality possible. Andrew saw news stories that portrayed him badly and wrote them off as personal attacks. He heard criticism and blamed advisors who had let things get out of hand. He felt his public standing slipping and responded by clinging even more tightly to the trappings of status: the title, the house, the security detail at the gate. Royal Lodge became both sanctuary and echo chamber. Meanwhile, the bills kept growing. Maintenance on a house of that size never paused. Roofs needed work, stone facades cracked, heating systems aged and demanded replacement. The grounds required constant mowing, pruning, and replanting just to look effortless. Andrew's income did not grow at the same rate. The allowance from the Queen's private funds covered the basics, but extras had to come from elsewhere: investments, help from wealthy friends, loans and arrangements that would look far more troubling in hindsight. He told himself it was all under control. The lease was long. The house was secure. The Queen would never let him fall. Outside the gates, the mood was shifting. Stories spread about Andrew's judgment, about the people he chose to befriend, about his apparent inability or refusal to see how certain photographs and appearances looked to the rest of the world. Royal Lodge cushioned those warning signs. Inside, the pattern barely changed: dogs on sofas, newspapers over breakfast, family photos staring down from every wall. The bubble held. For the moment. Chapter 7. Rumors at the Gate. The first cracks appeared in ways Andrew could still shrug off. There were tabloid stories about extravagant spending, questions about who picked up the bill for private jets when he traveled for business, photographs of him at parties, with people whose fortunes seemed to come from shadows rather than clear, respectable work. Each story on its own looked survivable, embarrassing, but not fatal. The kind of coverage that came with being a prince who was not quite important enough to shield, but far too visible to ignore. Royal Lodge became the place he ran to after each round of bad press. The house absorbed his anger and disbelief. Staff learned to read the signs. Shorter temper, longer silences, more hours shut away in his study with newspapers spread across the desk. Sarah defended him in public. His daughter stayed loyal in private. The Queen said nothing, a silence Andrew chose to hear as approval. But the stories did not stop. In the year 2011, questions surfaced about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, an American financier, a convicted sex offender, a man Andrew had been photographed with multiple times over the years. Andrew's explanation was simple. He had met Epstein through Ghislaine Maxwell, an old friend. The connection had been useful for making introductions in the business world. After Epstein's conviction, Andrew said, he had cut ties. Mostly. Then came the photographs of Andrew walking side by side with Epstein in New York's Central Park in the year 2010, well after the conviction. Andrew insisted he had flown over to end the friendship face to face. Critics said it looked far more like he had gone to keep it alive. The story churned through the press for weeks, then slid off the front pages. Royal Lodge drifted back to its quiet routine. Yet something had changed. The protective bubble around Andrew's life felt thinner, easier to puncture. Security incidents began to climb. In the year 2013, a man scaled the fence at Royal Lodge. In the year 2016, another intruder was found wandering the grounds. Both times, security intercepted them before they reached the house itself. Staff whispered about weak spots, cameras that left blind corners, patrol routes that did not cover every path. A system designed for a gentler era, struggling to keep up with modern obsession and risk. Andrew demanded upgrades, more cameras, more patrols, higher, stronger fences. The Crown Estate approved some of his requests and quietly declined others, citing budgets, proportionality, the fact that Royal Lodge was not Buckingham Palace and could not be treated like a royal fortress. Andrew felt exposed. The house that had once seemed like a fortress now felt as if it had hairline cracks in its walls. Inside, life carried on under steadily rising pressure. Sarah's finances remained shaky. Book deals that underperformed, business ventures that never quite worked, long trails of debt from earlier years of overspending, and bad advice. She leaned on Andrew's stability. He leaned on her presence. Both of them leaned on Royal Lodge as the one solid structure holding the rest of their lives together. Guests began to notice the strain. Dinners felt more forced. Conversations looped back again and again to the same themes. Unfair media, advisors who had mismanaged things, a public that, in Andrew's view, refused to recognize his service and loyalty. Old friends started turning down invitations. The house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a bunker where Andrew stockpiled grudges. The girls worried. They saw their father retreating into himself. They saw their mother struggling with money while living in a vast mansion that screamed wealth from every angle. They saw a situation that seemed impossible to sustain, but also impossible to fix. Royal Lodge demanded more money every year. The £7.5 million Andrew had poured into renovations in the early 2000s had not been a final bill. Old houses never stop asking for more. New estimates pointed to another £5 million worth of work coming due. Roofs again, failing drainage, structural repairs that could not be delayed without real risk. Andrew did not have £5 million. He did not have one spare million sitting in an account. The financial model that had once looked stable was falling apart. His allowance covered daily running costs, but not major restoration. Most of his available wealth had gone into the first wave of work. The lease that had once made him feel untouchable now looked like a snare. He could not sell the house to unlock its value. He could not walk away without losing everything he had sunk into it. Royal Lodge owned him as much as he officially occupied it. Then, in the year 2019, everything collapsed. Virginia Giuffre filed a lawsuit in the United States. She alleged that Jeffrey Epstein had trafficked her to powerful men, including Prince Andrew. She described specific encounters, specific dates, specific places. One photograph showed Andrew with his arm around her waist. Ghislaine Maxwell stood beside them, smiling into the camera. Andrew was in his early 40s in that photograph from the year 2001. Virginia Giuffre was 17. This time, the bubble did not bend. It broke. The walls of Royal Lodge could not keep this story out. Chapter 8. When a friend becomes a curse. Andrew's first instinct was denial. He admitted he had met Virginia Giuffre, but insisted he could not remember the encounter. The photograph was real, he said, yet the situation around it was harmless. The allegations were, in his view, completely false, driven by money, tied to a sprawling American legal battle that, as he saw it, had nothing to do with him. His advisors told him to stay quiet. Let the lawyers handle statements. Avoid feeding the tabloids with half-answers and off-the-cuff comments. Andrew ignored them. In November of the year 2019, he agreed to sit down with BBC Newsnight. He genuinely believed he could explain everything, clear his name, show the public that the accusations were ridiculous once they heard his side. The interview aired on a Saturday evening, 49 minutes that would dismantle what little remained of Andrew's reputation. He claimed he could not have been in London on the night in question because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. He said he did not remember ever meeting Virginia Giuffre, despite the photograph that placed them inches apart. At one point, he even suggested the image might have been altered. He described his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein as a useful way to make business connections. Staying at Epstein's properties, he explained, was simply practical, convenient basis for trips. When asked if he regretted the friendship, Andrew talked about the opportunities it had offered him in terms of networking. Only when pressed did he shift to acknowledging the victims. And even then, his tone made it sound as if he felt more wronged by the scandal than they had been by the crimes. The most damaging moment came when he tried to justify his visit to Epstein in New York in the year 2010, after the conviction. Andrew said he had traveled there to end the friendship face to face because that was the honorable and right thing to do. The phrase landed like a brick. Breaking up with a convicted sex offender in person, inside the man's mansion, did not sound honorable to viewers. It sounded like a flimsy excuse from someone who could not admit he had chosen to stay close to the wrong person. The interview went viral almost instantly. Clips tore across social media. Commentators called it a disaster, a slow-motion car crash, a textbook example of how not to handle a reputational crisis. Andrew walked away feeling he had been clear and straightforward. The audience saw something else entirely. A man defensive, detached, and apparently unable to grasp why his decisions looked so appalling to everyone else. Within days, the palace announced that Andrew would step back from royal duties. Not for a short pause, indefinitely. He would keep his title. He would keep his honorary military roles. He would keep Royal Lodge. But he would no longer represent the Queen. No more patronages, No more public engagements, no more pretending to hold a meaningful official role inside the institution. Andrew withdrew to Royal Lodge. The house that had always been his refuge now narrowed into his only real territory. The last place where he still felt like a prince rather than a headline. Staff noticed the shift immediately. Longer stretches went by without him leaving the grounds. Visitors grew rare. Meals were often eaten alone or only with Sarah at the table. Beatrice and Eugenie visited whenever they could. But even their presence could not repair what had been broken on television. They loved their father. They believed in his innocence. Yet they also understood what the interview had done. It had confirmed every negative story people already suspected about him. Royal Lodge itself seemed to change. The atmosphere grew heavier. Rooms that once felt lively now felt dim. The quiet between conversations stretched out, uncomfortable and thick. Andrew stopped hosting dinner parties, stopped guiding guests through the gardens, stopped playing the role of gracious custodian that had once given him a sense of purpose and importance. The armed security patrols still circled, staff still polished silver and trimmed hedges, but the house had lost its warmth. It felt less like a family home and more like a waiting room where Andrew sat, hoping for a vindication that never arrived. Outside the gates, the pressure intensified. Charities dropped his patronages. Military regiments that had once proudly claimed him as a figurehead quietly created distance. Organizations that had featured his name on glossy brochures now scrubbed it from their websites. The monarchy moved on as if he had already stepped into the past. The Queen made no public statement. Charles maintained a careful, chilly distance. The message could not have been clearer. Andrew was on his own. Royal Lodge became his entire universe because, functionally, he no longer had another one. He watched the news obsessively, recorded broadcasts, read every column, saw his name become shorthand for entitled privilege and catastrophic judgment. The house could not shield him from that. Its walls could not muffle the anger outside or repair the trust he had lost. But he still refused to leave. Royal Lodge was the last physical proof that he belonged to something bigger than the scandal, that he still had a place inside the royal story, even if the public no longer saw it. The lease remained intact. The Queen had not ordered him out. As long as he lived within those grounds, Andrew could tell himself he was still a prince with a role, not just a problem the family wanted to forget. The bills, however, did not care about narratives. They arrived on schedule: maintenance costs, staff wages, security expenses. Andrew's income had collapsed. The private allowance from the Queen continued, but everything else had evaporated. No business deals, no paid appearances, no consulting work linked to public duties. Royal Lodge cost around £250,000 a year simply to keep running. Andrew no longer had a clear, reliable way to pay that bill. The trap pulled tighter. The house he had fought to secure, the property he believed would guarantee his future, was now the place slowly dragging him toward financial ruin. Chapter 9. The Money Runs Out. September of the year 2022. Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral. Andrew was with her at the end. One of the few family members present when she passed. For a brief moment, his scandal faded into the background, pushed aside by visible, shared grief. He walked behind her coffin during the funeral processions, stood vigil beside it at Westminster Hall. The cameras caught him in naval uniform, tears in his eyes, a son mourning his mother. For a short time, the public softened. Whatever else Andrew had done, he was grieving. The softness did not last. King Charles III took the throne with clear priorities: streamline the monarchy, cut costs, modernize the institution, and quietly remove anyone who created more problems than they solved. Andrew fit that last category exactly. Within weeks, Charles made his position unmistakable. The allowance would end. Andrew would receive no further funding from the Duchy of Lancaster, no support from the sovereign grant, no financial help beyond what was strictly required for security. Officially, the decision was framed as practical. Andrew carried out no royal duties. He generated no positive value for the institution. Why should public money or royal funds support the lifestyle he had become used to? Andrew pushed back. He had served in the Falklands War. He had worked as a trade envoy for years. He insisted he had given his life to the family and to the crown. Charles did not move. The military service was 4 decades in the past. The trade role had ended in controversy. And the interview, that catastrophic BBC appearance, had humiliated the entire monarchy. Andrew was, from that point on, financially on his own. The numbers were unforgiving. Royal Lodge cost approximately £250,000 a year in basic maintenance alone. Staff salaries added another large, unavoidable sum. Security, technically funded by the Metropolitan Police, but constantly under review, was estimated at around £3 million annually. Andrew's Navy pension brought in roughly £20,000 a year. There was still some investment income, but nowhere near enough to cover the bills. Sarah had no stable income. Her business projects had collapsed. Her books no longer sold the way they once had. She depended on Andrew's financial base, and that base was cracking. The house itself needed immediate work. Roof repairs, exterior painting, window restoration, structural checks. Estimates ran to several £1,000,000. Andrew could not pay. He went to Charles for help. Charles refused. The confrontation quickly became family legend. 2 brothers fighting over money, status, and the meaning of loyalty. Charles saw Andrew as a dangerous liability who needed to face reality. Andrew saw Charles as turning his back on him at the worst possible moment. Behind the scenes, the palace floated other options. Frogmore Cottage, the smaller property vacated by Harry and Meghan, was available. Recently renovated. Big enough for Andrew and Sarah, far cheaper to run. Andrew refused. Royal Lodge was his home. His lease remained valid for many decades. He had spent millions improving the property. Walking away would mean admitting defeat, admitting that everything he had invested, money, pride, identity, was gone. Charles increased the pressure. No allowance, no exceptions. Either Andrew found a way to pay for Royal Lodge himself, or he would have to accept a smaller house. Friends stepped in. Reports surfaced of wealthy contacts offering loans. Former business associates providing quiet financial support. The details stayed vague, but the money clearly came from somewhere. From the outside, it looked terrible. A disgraced prince with no visible income still managing to fund a multi-million-pound lifestyle. People began to ask obvious questions. Who was paying, and what did they expect in return? What kind of access or influence were they buying? Andrew insisted everything was above board, private funds, legal arrangements, nothing improper. The public did not believe him. The same pattern played out yet again. Andrew making choices that might technically pass legal tests but looked rotten to everyone watching. Royal Lodge turned into a symbol of everything people hated about royal privilege. A man with no job, no income, an erect reputation living in a grand mansion while ordinary families worried about heating bills and food prices. From time to time, small groups of protesters gathered near the park gates. Never huge crowds, but large enough to be noticed. Signs demanding that Andrew leave. Chants about fairness, justice, and accountability. Inside, Andrew retreated further. He stopped reading most newspapers, avoided social media entirely. built himself a careful information bubble where he could still believe he was the victim of cruel, unjust persecution. Sarah remained his main companion. They ate together, watched television together, walked the grounds with the dogs, two people clinging to a way of life that had already slipped away, even if neither wanted to say it aloud. The house itself began to betray the strain. Paint dulled, stonework stained and weathered. The gardens were still tended, but not with the meticulous care they once received. Corners were cut. Little things went unfixed. Royal Lodge was fading slowly, and Andrew was fading with it. The question hanging over everything was simple: how long could this continue? Andrew convinced himself he could outlast the outrage, that public anger would shift to other scandals, that Charles, under pressure, would eventually relent. He was wrong on every count. The siege was only just beginning. Chapter 10. A Mansion in Slow Decay. By early 2023, Royal Lodge had begun to look tired. The white exterior paint, once crisp and bright, had faded to patchy gray. Shutters were weathered. Window frames flaked and cracked. The sort of quiet, constant maintenance that happens on well-funded estates had slowed to emergency fixes only. The grounds told the same story. The lawns were still mowed, but not with the old precision. Flower beds were weeded, yet rarely replanted. Trees were trimmed just enough to stay safe, not shaped to look beautiful. Staff numbers had fallen. Andrew could no longer afford the full team. Some roles were left vacant. Others were merged. People who had worked at Royal Lodge for years quietly slipped away to more secure jobs elsewhere. The house felt emptier. Dining rooms that once hosted big family meals sat dark. Rooms that needed constant care were simply closed off, left unused to cut costs. Andrew adapted by shrinking his world. He lived in fewer rooms, spending most of his time in his study or bedroom. Whole wings were allowed to go cold in winter to save on heating. Sarah tried to keep up a sense of normal life. When no staff were available, she cooked simple meals herself. She took on household jobs that, a decade earlier, would have been unthinkable for a duchess living in a royal home. But she could not disguise the truth. Royal Lodge was failing. The roof needed urgent work. Leaks had appeared in several places. Temporary patch jobs held for the moment, but everyone knew a full restoration would cost millions. The heating system was decades old and increasingly unreliable. Winters grew uncomfortable. Staff wore extra layers inside. Andrew complained constantly about the cold, yet there was no budget to rip everything out and replace it. Outside, the stonework showed deep weather damage. Cracks crept along walls. Drainage problems left water pooling around the foundations after heavy rain. Each problem made the next one worse. Every delayed repair turned into a bigger bill. The house and the man mirrored one another. Both had been impressive once. Both were now visibly deteriorating. Both refused to fully admit how bad the situation had become. Public anger had not faded with time. If anything, it had sharpened. Talk shows debated Andrew regularly. Should he keep his titles? Should he keep Royal Lodge? Should he still have armed security funded, even indirectly, by taxpayers? Opinion polls showed strong support for stripping all three. To most people, he looked like a man who had disgraced himself, damaged the monarchy's reputation, and still lived in comfort while giving nothing back. Royal Lodge became the lightning rod for that resentment. The mansion turned into a shorthand for everything people disliked about inherited privilege: a man with no job, no income, and a ruined name still living behind high walls in a sprawling estate. Social media amplified the fury. Photographs of Royal Lodge circulated constantly. Users compared its sweeping driveways and endless lawns to small houses where ordinary families squeezed every bill. Others calculated how many nurses or teachers could be funded for the price of Andrew's security. The anger reached Parliament. members of Parliament began asking direct questions. How much did Royal Lodge really cost the public? Could the Crown Estate terminate the lease? What powers did the king actually have to force Andrew to move? The answers were messy. The lease was legal and long-term. Andrew had met his renovation obligations. The Crown Estate could not simply throw him out without clear cause. But the political cost of protecting him was rising faster than any maintenance bill. Charles faced pressure from advisors and modernizers. Reform, or risk becoming irrelevant. Show that the monarchy can hold its own members to account. Prove that titles do not place anyone above consequences. Royal Lodge became the test case. Inside, Andrew swung between defiance and despair. Some days he talked about fighting in court to keep everything exactly as it was. Other days he barely left his bedroom. Beatrice and Eugenie visited less often. They had their own young families now, their own public images to defend. They loved their father, but they could no longer stand in front of him as human shields. The little garden cottage stayed exactly where it had always been. Nobody played there now. It had turned into a quiet memorial to another time. When Royal Lodge meant happy childhood summers and private family moments, not scandal and slow decline. Photographers with long lenses lurked at the edges of Windsor Great Park. They captured Andrew walking alone with his dogs, Sarah tending the garden, empty rooms visible through half-drawn curtains. Each new image became a story. Each story poured more fuel onto the anger. Royal Lodge was now described as Britain's most hated house. Not because the bricks or the gardens had done anything wrong, but because the building had become fused in people's minds with a man who would not accept that his era was over. The walls that once protected him now felt like barriers he could not cross. The lease that once seemed ironclad now felt like a set of chains. The status that had once validated his whole life was now choking him. Andrew had fought to keep Royal Lodge because he believed it proved he still mattered. Instead, it had become proof of the opposite. The house was rotting. His reputation was shattered. His money was gone. His family had, in different ways, moved forward without him. And still, he refused to leave. The standoff could not last forever. Something had to give. The only real question left was whether Andrew would choose to walk out on his own terms, or be forced to go when his last defenses finally collapsed. Chapter 11. The King Draws a Line. In January 2024, the announcement came without drama. Buckingham Palace released a short statement. Prince Andrew would be required to leave Royal Lodge. The Crown Estate had ended lease negotiations. Alternative accommodation had been arranged. No explanation, no apology, just a dry administrative notice that quietly shattered decades of assumption. Andrew had always believed his lease was untouchable. 75 years, legally binding. A contract the Crown Estate could not simply tear up without triggering a huge legal fight. He was wrong. The lease contained clauses, conditions Andrew was expected to meet, maintenance standards, ongoing financial obligations, evidence that he could sustain the property over the long term. On paper, he had failed on several counts. The required renovations were unfinished. The maintenance schedule had slipped badly. Most importantly, he could no longer show that he had the financial capacity to keep Royal Lodge in the condition the Crown Estate demanded. From the Crown Estate's side, resource is taken the Crown Estate teach. The reasoning was straightforward. Andrew had breached the lease terms. They were within their rights to act. Andrew's lawyers pushed back. The breaches were technical. The standards, they argued, were being enforced more harshly against Andrew than against anyone else. Other royal leases, they whispered, were not being examined this closely. Behind closed doors, Andrew's team insisted the real motive was political. Charles wanted his disgraced brother out. The public wanted blood. Ending the lease was, in their view, punishment dressed up as contract law. Legally, the arguments could go on forever, but in reality, the legal details no longer mattered. Charles had already made his decision. The monarchy needed a public example to prove it could police its own. Andrew was that example. Royal Lodge was the price. The palace stopped negotiating. The order stood. Andrew could leave voluntarily, or he could face a formal eviction process. Either way, he would not be staying. Frogmore Cottage was still empty, 5 bedrooms, recently renovated. Much smaller than Royal Lodge, but more than enough space for Andrew and Sarah. The rent would be manageable. The maintenance bills would no longer swallow him whole. Harry and Meghan had lived there briefly before leaving for America. Since then, Frogmore had sat as a symbol of a different royal exile. At first, Andrew refused even to consider it. Moving to Frogmore meant conceding defeat, admitting that he had been wrong, accepting that his rank no longer protected him. Royal Lodge was the last piece of his identity as a working prince. Without it, he would simply be a disgraced man with a courtesy title and nowhere grand to hang it. Sarah tried to bring him back to reality. They could not afford Royal Lodge anymore. The house was physically failing. A legal fight would only drag everything into more public humiliation. Andrew would not hear it. He spoke about principles, about promises he believed the Queen had made him, about family loyalty and a brother who, in his eyes, was abandoning him to save the institution. Yet the facts were brutal. Andrew had no real income, no reserves to fund major works, no way to keep Royal Lodge functioning even if he won a courtroom battle. Staying meant watching the house rot in slow motion, watching staff disappear one by one, watching leaks spread and plaster crumble, watching his last status symbol collapse in front of the cameras. Leaving meant public humiliation, accepting that the fight was over, moving into a house forever linked with Harry and Meghan, the other pair who had been pushed to the margins. Whichever door he chose, he lost. The media followed every twist. Commentators argued over whether Charles was being too ruthless or still too gentle. Callers on radio phone-ins demanded harsher action. Opinion polls showed huge support for forcing Andrew out. Royal Lodge turned into a national argument, less about bricks and gardens, and more about privilege, consequences, and whether a king would ever truly discipline his own brother. Protesters returned to the park gates, this time in greater numbers. Hand-painted signs read, "Evict Andrew and no more royal freeloaders." Security handled them carefully. No clashes, no dramatic arrests. Just a steady, visible line of public anger aimed at one man and the house he refused to surrender. Andrew watched from upstairs windows. He saw the placards, heard the chants drifting across the lawns, realized with a kind of numb clarity that he had become the villain in a story that would not end until he left. Inside Royal Lodge, time thickened, days blurred. Andrew moved through his routines on autopilot. Meals, short walks, television, restless nights. Sarah began packing in stages. She had accepted what he still fought. The battle was finished. Better to leave with some order than be thrown out in chaos. The house felt haunted. Every corridor held echoes. His grandmother's laughter, his daughters playing in the garden, the Queen sitting at the table for Sunday lunch. Decades of family life that had once seemed permanent now felt like scenes from someone else's story. All of it unraveling because Andrew had made decisions he could never take back. The king had drawn a line. Andrew could keep his title. He could appear in family photographs. He could retain the surface trappings of royalty, but he could not keep Royal Lodge. The mansion that was supposed to prove he still mattered had ended up proving something very different. That status without judgment eventually collapses under its own weight. The only unresolved question was how this would end. Would Andrew, at last, accept reality and walk out of Royal Lodge on his own 2 feet? Or would the final chapter be written by security officers and lawyers, escorting him out of the house he had tried so desperately to claim as his forever home? Chapter 12. Packing Up a Life. The moving process began in the spring of the year 2024. Not with drama, no news cameras at the gates, no live coverage, just quiet logistics handled by staff who had done this same, sad choreography many times before for other royal moves. Andrew supervised from a distance. He could not bring himself to fold his own clothes into boxes or take pictures off the walls. Staff did it for him. They wrapped photographs in tissue paper, boxed up books from his study, emptied wardrobes filled with naval uniforms he would never wear again. Every room demanded choices. What would go to Frogmore? What would disappear into storage? What would be given away? And what would simply be thrown out? The process exposed just how much Andrew had layered onto Royal Lodge over more than 20 years. Not only furniture and paintings, but the weight of a life built on the assumption that nothing would ever change. Letters from his Navy days, gifts from foreign dignitaries, framed photos from official visits that would never happen again. All of it kept carefully, because each item represented a version of himself he still wanted to believe in. Sarah handled the practicalities. She knew how to live through collapse. She had been bankrupted before, had faced front-page humiliation before. She understood, painfully well, how to survive transitions that feel impossible on day one and inevitable by the end. She sorted through kitchen cupboards, picked which pieces of furniture might fit in the smaller house, made lists what Frogmore needed, what Royal Lodge should keep for whoever came after. The staff worked with quiet, deliberate efficiency. Many had been with Andrew for years. They did not need him to spell out how humiliated he felt. They saw it in the way he walked the corridors and avoided eye contact. They packed his grandmother's things separately. The Queen Mother's chairs, her favorite lamps, the small ornaments Andrew had left exactly where she had placed them. Those pieces went into storage. He could not bear to throw them away, but Frogmore had no room for shrines to the past. Beatrice and Eugenie came to help. They arrived separately, stayed only a short while, and left with tight faces and red eyes. The little garden cottage was the hardest part. They walked through it together, Andrew, Sarah, and the girls, ducking slightly through the child-sized doorways. No one said much. This was where the girls had played house, where they had felt ordinary, where childhood had been allowed to exist outside scandal, outside lawyers, outside newspaper headlines. The cottage stayed exactly where it was, too fragile to move, too important to tear down. It would wait the way it always had for some future child to open its door and claim it. Beatrice cried quietly in a corner. Eugenie held her father's hand. Sarah took photos on her phone as if she were documenting a crime scene rather than a memory. Andrew just stood there, saying nothing. This was the moment when the illusion finally shattered, watching his daughters grieve for a home and a childhood they knew they would never get back. Removal vans arrived early one morning, big trucks that blocked the drive and made the whole thing visible to anyone watching from the edge of Windsor Great Park. Staff loaded boxes in a steady rhythm, furniture wrapped in blankets, paintings slipped into crates. Decades of accumulated life reduced to a numbered manifest on a clipboard. Andrew stayed inside for as long as he could. He watched from upstairs windows while his possessions vanished into the backs of the vans. Each departing load felt like something being cut out of him. In the end, Sarah persuaded him to leave before the final truck pulled away. Better, she said, to go while Royal Lodge still looked inhabited than to be the last figure walking out of an echoing, empty shell. They drove to Frogmore in Andrew's Range Rover, Sarah at the wheel, Andrew staring out of the window saying nothing, as the only world he recognized slid away behind them. The distance was short. Frogmore Cottage sat within the same Windsor estate, less than 3 miles from Royal Lodge. Close enough that Andrew could still glimpse his old home from certain roads, close enough that the loss felt deliberate, almost taunting. Frogmore looked small after Royal Lodge, neat, freshly painted, well kept, but unmistakably small. 5 bedrooms instead of something like 30. Modest gardens instead of sweeping parkland. Rooms that estate agents would call cozy. But that felt cramped to a man used to entire wings and long corridors. Staff had unpacked the essentials before he arrived. Beds made, towels hung, the kitchen stocked. Someone had even placed a few familiar ornaments where he would see them first, hoping to make the house feel welcoming. Andrew walked through slowly. His furniture looked oversized in these limited rooms. His photographs crowded the walls. Everything that had settled so naturally into Royal Lodge felt slightly ridiculous and out of scale here. This was Harry and Meghan's old house. That thought would not leave him alone. Andrew was now living in the home associated with the other couple who had been pushed to the edge of royal life. The symmetry felt intentional. Punishment written in floor plans. Sarah did her best to sound hopeful. The house was charming. The location was practical. They would adjust and build something new. Andrew did not respond. He drifted from room to room like a ghost haunting someone else's story. That first night at Frogmore, he could not sleep. The sounds were wrong. The ceilings felt low. The walls seemed too close. He kept expecting the house to open up into the vast spaces he had left behind. Sarah found him at 3 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights off. He was not crying, not talking, just sitting very still, alone with the knowledge that this place would never, ever feel like Royal Lodge. Royal Lodge was gone. The life he had spent decades constructing inside its walls was finished, and Prince Andrew, Duke of York, no longer had anywhere left to hide. Chapter 13. Who owns a royal house? Royal Lodge sits empty now. The furniture has gone. The photographs have been taken down. Rooms that once held decades of family life now echo with nothing but the footsteps of staff carrying out routine inspections. Yet one question hangs over the silence. Who actually owns this house? The answer is far less straightforward than it looks. Royal Lodge belongs to the Crown Estate, a vast property portfolio that lives in its own legal category. It is not private property in the way a normal house is. It is not government property in the usual sense either. It is something in between. The Crown Estate took shape in the year 1760, when King George III agreed to surrender the income from royal lands in exchange for a fixed annual payment from Parliament. That bargain still underpins the system today. The monarch does not personally own the Crown Estate, but it is not simply a public asset that ministers can sell off at will. Properties like Royal Lodge sit right in the middle of this gray area. They are historically important. They are tied to the identity of the monarchy. But they are managed as commercial assets that are supposed to generate income or serve clear strategic purposes. For roughly 2 centuries, that setup worked quietly. Royal Lodge housed working members of the family. They carried out engagements, cut ribbons, toured hospitals, and military bases. In return, they lived in historic buildings whose upkeep was justified as the cost of monarchy. On paper, the trade felt balanced. Andrew broke that balance. He kept the house after losing his role. He tried to maintain the lifestyle, while no longer offering the service that had once been used to defend it. The equation stopped adding up. The Crown Estate's decision to reclaim Royal Lodge was not only about leaky roofs and missed inspections, it was also about redefining what royal privilege is supposed to mean inside a modern democracy. Instinctively, the public grasps this. Polls show that most people do not object to royals living in historic houses, as long as those royals visibly contribute. William and Catherine at Adelaide Cottage make sense to many. They work, they are seen, they represent the institution. Andrew at Royal Lodge did not make sense. He was living a royal life without performing royal duties. The lease Andrew signed looked generous because it assumed he would always be a working royal. Low rent in exchange for a status and role that could be used to justify the deal. Once that role vanished, the arrangement became impossible to defend. But Andrew's case also exposes a bigger issue. How does royal housing actually work? Charles lives at Clarence House, which belongs to the Crown Estate. William has Adelaide Cottage. Anne owns Gatcombe Park privately. Edward lives at Bagshot Park under a Crown Estate lease. Each address comes with different terms. Each agreement carries different duties and expectations. The system is patchwork, shaped by tradition, personal negotiation, and family politics rather than by a single, transparent policy. Andrew's removal drags that system into the open. People are now voicing questions that used to be seen as impolite or niche. How much does it cost to keep these places running? Who picks up the bills? If a royal stops working, should they lose their grace and favor home at once? Or is there a middle ground? There are no simple answers, because the rules have always been flexible, applied case by case, adjusted according to internal family dynamics and shifting public mood. Royal Lodge has become the test for whether those old, quiet arrangements can survive modern scrutiny. The Crown Estate's stance suggests they cannot, at least not without change. Royal homes now need a justification, public benefit, clear purpose. Andrew offered neither. Some critics argue the whole system is rotten at its core. Why should anyone live in a mansion because of an accident of birth? Why should taxpayers underwrite security and maintenance for people who do nothing in return? Others defend the tradition. The monarchy has always included non-working relatives. Royal houses, they say, carry symbolic weight, help preserve history, and cannot be measured purely in profit and loss. Royal Lodge now sits right at the center of that argument. The house itself is Grade 2 listed, legally protected as a historic building. It cannot be demolished or heavily altered without official permission. Its survival as a structure is not in doubt. So what happens next? The Crown Estate has choices. It can lease Royal Lodge to another family member under stricter terms. It can open parts of the property for public tours. It can use the house for official events, conferences, or retreats, or it can leave it empty for a time while the entire approach to royal housing is reconsidered. Whatever option they pick will send a signal about what kind of monarchy Britain wants. One that clings to tradition no matter the political and financial cost? One that behaves more like a business, constantly measuring value and return? Or something in between, preserving history, but expecting accountability and visible contribution in exchange? Andrew's lease belonged to an older mindset, low rent, light oversight, quiet assumptions that status would last forever and justify almost anything. That mindset is dying. Royal Lodge is its clearest casualty. The house will endure. It has already survived roughly 3 centuries of wars, abdications, coronations, and family dramas. Whoever moves in next will step into a long line of royals who used it as an escape hatch from palace formality. But the rules around it have changed. Royal Lodge will never again function as someone's private kingdom, insulated from outside questions, protected only by a title on the gate. The walls are still the same. The gardens are still beautiful. The little cottage where princesses once played still stands in its corner of the grounds. What has changed is the meaning. Royal Lodge has shifted from a symbol of royal comfort to a warning about royal accountability, from safe haven to cautionary tale. Chapter 14. A new story for an old house Royal Lodge has been many things. A keeper's cottage for staff who manage the royal hunting grounds. A romantic retreat for Georgian princes slipping away from court formality. A family home for a reluctant king who needed somewhere he could breathe. A widow's sanctuary for half a century. A divorced prince's last fortress. And now, an empty mansion waiting for its next chapter. The building has never stayed the same for long. Each generation has reimagined it, added wings, changed colors, rearranged rooms, turned it into whatever the current resident needed most. That pattern will continue. The only question is what shape it takes next. The Crown Estate is weighing options. Nothing has been announced publicly, but several possibilities circulate quietly through royal circles and estate planning meetings. One option is to lease Royal Lodge to another working royal under rewritten terms, higher rent, stricter maintenance rules, regular inspections, a contract that spells out, in black and white, that the house comes with obligations as well as comfort. Princess Anne's name appears often in those conversations. She is approaching 75 and still works a heavy program of engagements. Gatcombe Park is her private home. Royal Lodge could, on paper, serve as an official residence supporting her duties while remaining a Crown Estate asset. Edward and Sophie are another theoretical fit. Their workload has increased since Andrew stepped back. Royal Lodge could serve as a southern base, with Bagshot Park remaining their primary home. But both scenarios have obvious problems. Anne does not need another house and is famously practical. Edward and Sophie are settled where they are. Moving them would look less like strategy and more like shuffling pieces to cover an awkward gap. A second option is to open Royal Lodge to the public, not as a full-time museum, but in a limited way. Guided tours of selected historic rooms, access to parts of the gardens in summer, educational programs about George VI, the Queen Mother, and the role the house played in their lives. There is a precedent. Frogmore House opens for a few days each year. Clarence House offers summer tours. Royal Lodge could follow a similar pattern. Mostly private, occasionally accessible. Ticket revenue would help offset maintenance bills. Limited public access would make it easier to justify keeping the property within the Crown Estate. It would also signal transparency, an invitation to see a place people feel they have been indirectly funding for years, but nothing is simple. Royal Lodge sits deep inside Windsor Great Park. Security concerns make public access complicated. Visitor facilities, parking, and crowd management systems do not currently exist. Building them would cost millions before a single ticket is sold. A third option is to repurpose Royal Lodge purely for official use, rather than as a personal residence. It could host high-level receptions, provide extra accommodation during state visits, serve as a venue for private meetings that need discretion without the heavy symbolism of Windsor Castle. In that model, Royal Lodge becomes a working asset, maintained to a high standard, used regularly, but not tied emotionally or politically to any one family member. No more sense of it being a gift to an individual whose conduct might later cause trouble. This vision fits neatly with Charles's idea of a slimmed-down monarchy. Fewer perks, more function, properties serving the institution, not individual comfort. A fourth option, mentioned rarely and nervously, is to lease Royal Lodge to someone outside the royal family entirely. It is not impossible. Crown Estate properties are sometimes leased to private tenants under strict heritage constraints. A private leaseholder would be obliged to maintain the building to conservation standards, accept limits on alterations, and possibly allow occasional public access. That would pull Royal Lodge out of the royal housing argument altogether. The financial burden would shift to a private purse. The Crown estate would bank a significant income stream, but it would also feel like a retreat, a quiet admission that some royal properties are now too expensive to justify as royal homes. And once one house goes, pressure grows to ask which one should be next. For now, no final choice has been made. Royal Lodge sits in limbo. A skeleton staff keeps the basics going. Groundskeepers still cut the grass. Security teams still patrol the perimeter. Lights still come on at night. But the house has no resident, no clear assignment, no defined future. It has been here before. After George IV died, Royal Lodge drifted, underused, and half forgotten. After George VI died, it might easily have been closed or repurposed. Instead, the Queen Mother claimed it and gave it another 50 years of vivid, lived-in history. The house has survived by adapting, by attaching itself to people who needed exactly what it could offer. The problem now is that it is not clear anyone needs what Royal Lodge offers anymore. A 30-room mansion in a royal park costs millions of pounds a year to keep alive. What modern royal truly requires that much space? What role justifies that kind of expense in an era of tight budgets and public scrutiny? The answers are not obvious. Royal Lodge was built for a world where royals needed secluded retreats to disappear from public view, where sprawling estates were normal rather than awkward, where a title automatically opened every door. That world is shrinking. It may already be gone. Royal Lodge will almost certainly endure as bricks and stone. Historic buildings usually do, but it may endure as something entirely different from what it once was. Not a private home, not a secret refuge. Perhaps just a beautiful, costly monument to a system that took too long to decide what it wanted to be in the modern world, and discovered too late that the walls were telling a different story than the one it thought it was living. Chapter 15. What this mansion says about us. Royal Lodge is not just Andrew's story. It's a mirror held up to an entire system, one that protects people who don't deserve protection, rewards status over service, and takes decades to admit what everyone already knows. Andrew's mistake wasn't loving the house. It was believing the house made him untouchable. He spent 20 years treating Royal Lodge as proof of his importance, a mansion that said he still mattered, even as his reputation collapsed around him. The public saw something different, a man hiding behind walls, clinging to symbols he hadn't earned, demanding privilege without accepting responsibility. The standoff revealed a fundamental truth. Titles don't protect you from consequences. They just delay them. For the monarchy, Royal Lodge became the price of credibility. Charles had to prove the institution could hold its own accountable. That family loyalty had limits. That being a prince didn't mean immunity. Forcing Andrew out wasn't cruelty. It was survival. But the lesson extends beyond one disgraced prince and one mansion. Most people will never live in a royal lodge, will never sign a 75-year lease on a historic estate, will never face eviction from a house tied to 3 centuries of history. But many know what it feels like to hold on to something past its time, a job that no longer fits, a relationship that's already over, a version of yourself that doesn't match reality anymore. Andrew's tragedy wasn't losing Royal Lodge. It was wasting years fighting a battle he'd already lost, pouring money he didn't have into a house that couldn't save him, believing status would protect him when status was the problem. Royal Lodge taught him what it teaches everyone eventually. Walls can't shield you from truth. Beautiful surroundings don't make ugly situations disappear, and sometimes the place you fight hardest to keep is exactly what's destroying you. The house stands empty now. waiting for whatever comes next. The real question isn't what happens to Royal Lodge. It's whether we learn what it tried to teach us.